Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, this is the Moondrop Venus. This is Moondrop's second ever headphone, and they're swinging pretty big with this one. They're calling the Venus a flagship headphone. It's got a 100mm planar magnetic driver, and well, at $600, it's got some pretty stiff competition, like the recently reviewed Hifiman Edition XS. Maybe more to the point, though, I feel like the Venus is effectively Moondrop's their formal challenge to the headphone world. And given what they've been able to do with IEMs for the past couple of years, I was pretty curious to find out, can Moondrop do it with headphones? And so for the past couple of weeks, I've been living with the Venus and comparing it to some other headphones like the Hifiman Edition XS, and we're going to talk about that today. So, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're here now live, how's it going? Happy Sunday afternoon-ish. If you have any questions about the Venus or anything else that we talk about today, please leave it in the live chat. And at the end of this review, we'll spend some time having a little bit of a conversation. But for starters, I guess just a quick shout out to Shenzhen Audio for sending in the Venus for review. If you want to check out the Venus or anything else they've got, I've got a link to Shenzhen in the description down below. With that out of the way, let's jump back to the table and start talking about the physical stuff here on the Moondrop Venus. We'll talk about what's in the box, we'll talk about the build quality, comfort, all that stuff. Then we'll get into talking about the sound. We'll talk about the sound signature, what I like, what I dislike, and then we'll bring in the Hifiman Edition XS for some very direct comparisons. So, what do you get inside the box? The box itself, first of all, I'll show briefly. It is large, but it does fit on my table somewhat. It's a nice looking box, but what you get inside of it is what you see here on the table. So, you do get, of course, a standard 3.5 to 6.3 millimeter adapter, which means that you, of course, also get a standard 3.5 millimeter cable. Let me pull this out. And I gotta be honest, well, it actually comes with two cables, but I wanna start by talking about this cable because this is actually one of, in my opinion, one of the best headphone cables I've ever used. It might not seem like much, but I really, really dig this cable. So it is 3.5 millimeter on both ends, right? So it's got a dual entry 3.5 millimeter, and then it terminates in 3.5 millimeter as well. And as you can kind of see, it's just a nice, lightweight, well-behaved cable. It is cloth covered, which might not be totally obvious on camera. It is cloth covered, but where some cloth covered cables can be a little bit stiff, I honestly find the behavior on this cable to be just absolutely perfect. And it's nice and lightweight, which I really dig. And it's the right length. It's a portable length. It's about 4 feet long. So I'm really, really happy with that stock cable. Now, Moondrop also includes this aftermarket, or this, I'm going to call it aftermarket because they actually sell this separately for the Void. They sell this separate cable, which I guess is like an upgraded cable. And well, it comes in the box of the Venus, which is cool, but I gotta be honest, as nice as this cable is, I actually like the stock 3.5 mil cable better. What this one does have is it does have a balance connector. This is a 4.4 millimeter balance cable. And then down here, of course, the standard 3.5s that go into the headphone itself. And honestly, this is a perfectly fine cable. If this was the stock cable, I probably wouldn't have too many complaints about it. It's maybe a little bit on the stiff side. I think the braid on it is maybe a little bit too tight. Would be, I don't know, my speculation on exactly what contributes to that. But I would say this is a perfectly fine cable. But unfortunately for this cable is just stellar for me. I love, love, love the 3.5 mil cable. I hope that they sell this one separately. They do sell this one separately currently. I hope they sell this one separately because I kind of want it for all of my dual 3.5 millimeter headphones. Okay, that's going to bring us into talking about the headphone itself here with the Moondrop Venus. And I'm going to start by talking about kind of the material choices. We'll talk about a little bit about the aesthetics, and then we'll talk about comfort. So material choices on the Venus, as you can probably tell, this is a lot of metal. This is a very, very metal headphone. If you're into metal, right on. But yeah, you've just got like this metal band up here. I'm guessing it's some sort of sprung steel, although it almost feels more like an aluminum, but I don't know. I feel like aluminum is not usually super flexible. So what do I know? But otherwise, the yokes here are metal. You've got these metal surrounds around the cups, and then of course the backs are laden in this very fancy, ornate, and maybe divisive design pattern back here, but I gotta be honest, I think it looks pretty cool. I mean, I wasn't supposed to talk about the aesthetic stuff. We're just talking about whatever. All right, good materials. In fact, you know, it's so much metal around this thing that I was really struggling to find any bits of plastic. There is a little bit of plastic here where the headband, like the headband strap, has got this this flexible design, and where it mounts to the headphone itself is a little bit of plastic, but really just premium, I guess, materials all around. The pads here are they're definitely pleather. I would say these are not the plushest of ear pads, but they feel reasonably nice. And I guess, I don't know, generally pretty impressed with the build quality on this, at least in terms of materials. One thing I will point out here in terms of just the materials is that there have been a couple of times, and there've been a couple of times you can see where this kind of passes back there, that I've caught my finger in between the metal there. Basically having my hand on the ear cups and lifting it up to my head, I've got my finger caught in there and it's pinched a little bit. And now the first time it happened, I was like, that seems surprising. Let me go check all my other headphones to see if that's a thing that they can do. And I was actually able to pinch my fingers on other headphones. So maybe that wasn't so much a unique thing here on the Venus, but it did happen to me a couple other times beyond that. So, and that's a thing that's only really happened to me here on the Venus. I don't know if it's that the gap there is a little bit larger than normal. I don't know that it's maybe a little bit sharper than normal. I'm not sure exactly what's contributing there, but just watch your fingers when wearing this headphone. All right, let's talk about the aesthetics. Again, I think that there is some debate about whether or not this outside pattern is attractive. I definitely come on the side of, I think this is a very handsome looking headphone. Just overall, the aesthetics of this thing come together pretty well. I love the single tone metal look of it. Just really quite nice. It's got the distinct but simple outer grille. The outer headband is maybe a little bit on the large side, and we'll show this. You'll see that what it looks like on my head in a bit as we talk about comfort. It is a little bit on the large side. But I don't know, generally pretty happy with the aesthetic. The one thing that I will kind of quibble about is that when this thing is off the head, the ear pads don't touch. And I know that might not seem like a significant complaint, but it's the sort of thing that kind of annoys me, is that they don't touch. If you angle them outwards, they do touch a little bit. They do kiss together, and I think it looks a little bit nicer, but overall it does kind of come across a little bit floppy and sloppy because of the limited clamp factor on this headphone. Okay, now that'll lead us into talking about comfort. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is that given all the metal on this thing, you might suspect it's a little bit on the heavy side. In fact, it's 570 grams on my scale without the cable, which is pretty heavy. And yeah, I guess I was talking about clamp. The heavy weight plus the clamp on this headphone, which is actually a little bit on the lightweight side, like there's not a lot of clamp on it, means that it was a little bit, struggled for stability on my head with this. Now I was able to kind of force it by bending the headband a little bit, got a little bit of extra clamp out of it, but overall I would just consider this is not a very clampy headphone. It is a little bit heavyweight, and because of that, I don't know, you're not going to do any sports in this headphone, but I don't know if anyone actually thought that they were going to be doing jogging while wearing a Moondrop Venus. You're not going to do it. It's not going to work, but you're probably not too surprised by that. Otherwise, I mean, there is loads of room in the ear cups. Let's see if I can pull that up. You can see, again, these are 100 millimeter wide drivers, so that gives you a nice wide ear pad, and the thickness of the outer part of the ear pad you can see is not too thick, so that just leaves a ton of room in here for the ears. Now, because of that, well, I guess I also want to say, like, you can probably tell that the depth on the ear pads is not super deep, but I still had no issues with my ear touching the driver or anything like that, so generally pretty good with comfort. The only thing that I will say is that they are rather large, so because they're rather large, kind of like I was describing with the Hifiman Edition XS, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to get a good seal on my head. And my head's not especially small. If you have an especially small head, this issue might even be exaggerated for you, but they're very large pads. You need a pretty large surface area to get a good seal. And because the depth on the pads is not super deep, they're not like the kind of like soft, squishy pads that are just gonna completely cave. You can kind of see as I put this thing on my head, the shape of the ear pad is not really changing much, so it's not conforming so much to my head. These are pretty small quibbles, I'll be honest, but just some things I thought would be worth talking about, again, especially if you know that you've got somewhat of a smaller head, and no shame in a smaller head. So yeah, there's that. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this suspension strap, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, just in terms of its build materials, but I think it's also worth talking about here in terms of comfort, in that I think the suspension strap on this thing is a little bit too tight. So I generally like the suspension strap idea. The way that Meze does it, I really love it. So you just never have to worry about adjusting the headphone. You just plop it on your head, the thing automatically adjusts, and I like that. But because the strap, the tension on it is a little bit on the tight side, I do find that it kind of ends up pulling the headphone upward a little bit more than I would like. Basically, the headphone doesn't just, effortlessly drop on my head and stay in place. There's a little bit of an upward tug on it, and it does mean that there is then a little bit of an additional sort of downward pull on the top of my head, in addition to this being somewhat of a heavy headphone. So that's a little thing. I guess just overall, my impressions here on the build quality is I think it's a very good looking headphone, and it definitely does not feel cheap, but it does, I think, miss on the details a little bit. So that's my overall thoughts here on the build quality. Let's now talk about the sound. And the sound on this set, all right, like I normally do, we'll start with talking about the signature, which, if you had any doubts, this is very much a neutral sound signature. It's a little bit bright up top. It's got linear lower mids into the very linear bass. Overall, honestly, tuning wise, this is not too far off of what you would normally expect from something like Hifiman. It is a very mid-range focused tune without a lot of coloration. If you're looking for a bass cannon, the Moondrop Venus is not a bass cannon. So that's the general overall tonality. What do I like about the sound here on the set? Well, you should be not too surprised that I like that tonality. In fact, I think that's excellent tuning here on the Moondrop Venus. On one hand, you would expect Moondrop to nail tuning, but on the other, this is really just their second attempt at a headphone. So it's pretty impressive that they've done as good a job with the tuning as they have. Just generally, it's, I think, great with vocals. That puts vocals front and center without putting them overly forward. And just, I mentioned that this is kind of similar to the way that Hifiman does their tunings with their neutral tuning. What I think that Moondrop actually does better is that there's a little bit more body in the vocals. And we'll talk about this a little bit more directly in the head-to-head. But I think that the vocals come across fuller and richer on this set, even though, again, this is not like a thick bassy set. Don't think of this as like a warm. This is very much in the realm of clinical and neutral, but I think that the way that they've done the tuning on this thing really does give it just that extra bit of richness in the mid-range that I like. And apart from that, well, it's a planar driver. So there are some planar qualities that I think are well represented here in the Venus. You get fast delineated transients. You get that pluck factor from the planar. Just generally, you get a strong sense of detail and micro contrast, which for me is a big important thing, because I don't like a strong V-shaped sound signature. I like a neutral sound signature, but the potential cost of not having a lot of that macro contrast baked into the frequency response is that you can end up with a headphone that is a little dull listening. This is what people are afraid of with a neutral tune, but if you can nail the micro contrast, you can have a neutral tune and still present all of the finer detail and nuance in the music. And I think that the Venus does that really, really quite well. And then all the usual stuff, they've got clean separation between instruments and decent sense of head stage and imaging on the set. The other thing that I think is pretty standout here on the Venus And this is especially standout given where the bass levels are at, which are neutral bass levels. These are not a bassy set, but I think the bass quality on this thing is actually really good. The bass extends well into the sub bass frequency, so it's not like mid bass focus or anything like that. So that just means that the bass that's here, and again, it's not a lot of bass, but the bass that's here, it gives you like a pretty decent sense of physicality. And it has sort of that follow through in the hits on the bass that makes it really pretty satisfying. So that's what I like about the sound here on the Moondrop Venus. But of course, there are going to be some things I don't love about it. So let's talk about it. For starters, the treble on the Venus can be a little bit on the splashy side sometimes. Now, I want to say this is actually not as big an issue as I was expecting when I initially graphed the frequency response here on the Venus. When I initially graphed it, I thought that is a bright looking set. I'm a little scared, but in listening to it, most of the time the treble is actually not an issue. But there are occasionally times, especially with things like hi-hats in the music, that it can just cross over to the side of being splashy, which just means it sounds a little bit unrefined, a little bit on the harsh side, not so much fatiguing. Like I didn't find it like zingy and like long-term fatiguing in that sense. It just sometimes came across, again, a little bit splashy. Again, hi-hats were kind of a common occurrence, but not even all hi-hats. Like there's some of, I'll call out, okay, what was it? Fleetwood Mac's Rumors album. I found that the hi-hats on that came across a little bit splashy in the set, but even listening to the same instrument, hi-hats on Parcel's live album, I actually thought that they came across pretty decent on this set. So not a totally consistent issue there with the treble. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'll be honest, this is probably, in my opinion, the weakest part of the Moondrop Venus, is that the imaging on the set is decent, but in contrast to some other competitors, which again we'll talk about, it's a little bit blurred and kind of jumbled, right? Like you still get that clean sense of separation between sounds. There's good sense of layering and depth because that bass quality is so good on here. It's just that when it comes to sort of that pinpoint precision of things in 3D space, and again, this is the thing that really comes across when you are listening to live music, and there are multiple microphones recording the live music, and you get that real strong sense of room space. I feel like the Venus doesn't quite represent those things as well as some other stuff. Again, separation and distinction is all good. It's just really about that pinpoint 3D space that it doesn't quite do as well. It's just not so stable as some other sets. So those are my overall thoughts here on the Moondrop Venus. But like I've been alluding to, we're going to compare this with the Hifiman Edition XS, which I just recently reviewed and really reviewed it in anticipation of doing this Venus review. So let me clear my table and make room for these two headphones. Let's talk about how they compare head to head, okay? All right, our competitors. We just talked about you. The Moondrop Venus, 100 millimeter planar magnetic driver, $600, although I think it's $550 now. And then this is the Hifiman Edition XS. I actually don't know the size of this planar driver, except it is massive, as you can kind of tell. It's not quite as big or wide, but it is very tall. And the price on this one is actually a little bit cheaper at $500. So sound signature wise, I already alluded to this a little bit. They're very, very similar. They're both in the realm of neutral and both in the realm of kind of like a clinical, somewhat bright neutral. The Venus, very, very good mid-range tuning, a little bit bright up top, but really just excellent mid-range tuning to my ear. Whereas the Edition XS, it's neutral. In comparison, I think the vocals on the Edition XS come across a little bit thinner. There's less body to the overall sound, despite the fact that this actually has more mid-bass punch, which again, you can see in a graph and listening to them head to head, it was fairly clear to hear, but it still comes across tonally thinner and less body. It's also a bright set up top, but maybe a little bit softer and a little bit airier, whereas again, the treble tuning on this set can sometimes get into the realm of splashy. Overall though, if I were to rank these in terms of just the tonal balance, I actually think I like the Venus better than the Edition XS. Good job, Moondrop. Okay, let's talk now about the technicalities. The Venus, again, you get that decent planar quality, clean separation, and where I think this is really pretty standout is in that bass quality. It just really digs quite deep, and again, it's not a lot of bass, but where there is bass here, it sounds nice and solid and very satisfying. Imaging is a little bit jumbled up on the set, and again, the treble can occasionally get a little bit splashy, but overall, I think a very competent technical performer here in the Venus. Whereas the Hifiman Edition XS has kind of got some different strengths. To be honest, I think the technical aspects on the Edition XS are honestly pretty stellar at this price range. The head stage, decidedly bigger here on the Edition XS, and the imaging quality is, in head-to-head comparison, it's really pretty obvious that the Edition XS does a better job with, again, sort of that pinpoint 3D positioning of sounds. Again, with especially live performances, the Edition XS is pretty awesome to listen to. The downsides here on the Edition XS, though, would be that the bass quality, I think, is actually not as good as the bass quality here on the Venus. There's more mid-bass punch, but you can definitely feel kind of the difference in the bass qualities, where this sounds nice and solid and this sounds a little bit on the hollow side. I don't know if it's just because this has a little bit of a mid-bass emphasis and slight roll off into the sub-bass. I don't know. I don't want to over-interpret the frequency response, but I can say that in listening experience, the bass sound here maybe sounds a little bit punchier, but it definitely comes across a little bit hollow, and that also carries through to the vocals. So those are the differences. If I were ranking these purely in terms of technical performance, it wouldn't be, they're both pretty good, but man, the Edition XS really is pretty impressive. So I would say the Edition XS is overall, in my opinion, the more impressive technical performer. All right, and then finally, let's talk about how they compare in terms of form factor. The Venus is, as we just got done talking about, an all metal build. It's got a I think, very handsome aesthetic to it. Generally really quite dig it. It is a little bit rough around the edges in some ways, right? You've got the literal roughness in that it kind of pinches me every once in a while. The grill is maybe a little bit rough to the touch. And then you've got this headband, which is, I think, just overly tensioned and would be better with a lighter tensioned elastic strap in it, but generally pretty nice. The Edition XS, in comparison, let's punch in on you. I think it looks pretty nice. Maybe it looks a little bit plainer, and maybe I'm just saying that because this aesthetic has been used on a bunch of Hifiman headphones. But overall, I think the biggest difference is that the materials in this definitely feel cheaper than the materials here on the Venus. There's just a lot more plastic, but it does benefit in this thing being a lot lighter weight, whereas the Venus is around 570 grams, right? This one, I think, was like 380 grams, almost 200 grams lighter than this. That's like almost a third less than the weight of the Venus, which is pretty considerable. And I guess also worth calling out, if you missed my review of the Edition XS, is that, well, this thing is also not for small heads. You can see on my head, it fits quite large. I don't really have an issue getting a seal, although sometimes, I mean, I can definitely break a seal if I wear it wrong. So I imagine if, you know, your head is a little bit on the small side, you might have a difficulty getting a seal with either of these. And what that means is you're just gonna get less sub bass and a little bit more mid bass. But overall, if I were to rank these just in terms of form factor, honestly, I think I'd pick the Edition XS. As much as I like the nicer build materials on here, like the metal feels nice and I like the aesthetic of it, I think the lighter weightness of the Edition XS and just the more polished build of it, I like better. But I don't know, that's pretty close. So I think that's gonna do it for my thoughts here on the Moondrop Venus. Out of 5 stars, I do have to give it a rating. Out of 5 stars, this is their second attempt at a headphone, their first attempt at a planar driver headphone. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed. I'm gonna give the Venus a solid 4 stars out of 5. Excellent tuning and technical performance that is very, very competent. It's not quite up there with the Edition XS, but I do think that they got the tuning better than Hifiman did. So depending on what you value out of a headphone at this price range, probably dictate which decision you would make. But if you're interested in checking out the Moondrop Venus, of course, I've got a link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, you like this comparison, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and YouTube will let you know next time I'm live. Unless you're here live now, in which case just hang out and let's have a chat about the Venus, the Edition XS, and life in general. Have a happy Sunday. I'll catch you on the next super review.